everybody. Welcome this afternoon to the second part of the lettuce cultivation series, Propagation and Young Plant Production. I'm Janine Wright, the Senior Communications Specialist with Prospian, and we're glad to have you join us today. Just a couple things before we get started. The Adept Ag and Prospian will both be at Indoor AgCon, so we'd really love to have you pay us a visit. So just keep in mind, Adept Ag's booth number is 312 and Prospian is 1301. So hopefully we can have a chance to visit with you and meet you at Indoor AgCon. Now I want to introduce our presenters for today. So joining us today, we have the same group, but we have John Bonner, owner of Great Lakes Growers. And then we have Rob Vanderstein. He's the irrigation specialist at Adept Ag. And then Dave Taylor, the Enterprise Solutions Manager at Adept Ag. And then Tony Abbas, Director of Business Development. So we'll have them join in. I'll leave it up to them if they want to tell you a little bit more about what they do. As we're going through the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll try and get those answered. We'll answer the ones that are pertinent to what we're talking about at the time, during the presentation, and try and get to any others. We'll leave a little time at the end for that. So last week we, covered germination. If you haven't seen that webinar, you can find that on YouTube or on Bright Talk. And we left it kind of more of a little open forum. So that this time we're going to, tighten up in three areas. And kind of talk about, first about some irrigation, and then environmental controls, and then structure and infrastructure in regards to lettuce propagation, taking your plants from the propagation stage into the young plant production. So with that, I'm going to turn it. Let's jump right into irrigation and talking about the different growth stages. So Rob, why don't we start off with you? You're a specialist.
All right, I'll jump into it. Okay, my name is Rob Vanderstein, former vine vegetable grower many years ago, and I have been working as an irrigation design and sales guy for the last 22 years across many different formats. But today we are going to talk about irrigation in lettuce projects, primarily in moving channel lettuce projects, because that is the focus of this seminar. And I have to, I guess, pre-qualify this to say that we certainly, as a company, offer a lot of suggestions and design suggestions. But at the end of the day, we have to work with the grower to give them what they want. Often in corporate farms, they're not sure what they want, but in smaller family farms, they absolutely have a direct idea as to how they want to have this. And even if I don't agree with it, I still got to make sure that I help him get what he is looking to achieve. Any irrigation system starts off with the freshwater supply. So that is key, particularly in a lettuce project. We do know that lettuce is a low EC crop and very sensitive to certain things. So generally speaking, we look at that water analysis of the incoming water as the first critical part of the irrigation puzzle. So if you're dealing with well water or pond water, or anything like that, we know that we may have to treat that water. That water may have to go through filtration process. It may have to go through an RO process, which is unfortunate because it's expensive and has a lot of waste stream. But, getting that water quality to an acceptable level is the first critical part to this puzzle. Then we talk about propagation. John mentioned last week a bunch of different ways of propagating. His is a fairly simple: propagate on a cart and then throw it on a floor and run it through until it's ready to be planted out. But there are other systems, and each of those will require something different. Initially, you're going to just basically have a wet tray that you're putting the seed into, and then beyond that, you're going to start with a misting program. And then it may be, if you're doing a multi-level propagation system, you might have an ebb and flood system in there, or you might have misting lines overhead in a cart stalls type system. Regardless, we need to have good quality water, and we need to have a propagation recipe. So that is, a fertilizer recipe, an AB mix, and a pH level that is suited for that variety or those varieties that you're propagating, and a system that's incredibly reliable, because we've got plants coming in every day, and we need to know that they're actually getting what we're telling them to get. So that misting system or a boom operation like John has is fairly simple, because there's not a lot of runoff. You're basically getting the slabs or the cubes or the trays wet, whatever you're growing into. Even if you're growing in directly in a direct seed, you're just trying to get those channels wet on a regular basis. And it doesn't take much, because the plants are not transpiring much at this point yet. The first few days are not even under lights. But once they do put lights on, you're going to see a little bit of weather conditions and environment conditions and plant transpiration that's going to start requiring a few irrigation cycles. Some growers will not recirculate their propagation water. That whatever runoff water is coming from that will be lumped in with the rest of their project. There are some growers that are doing the ebb and flood for propagation. That requires a fair chunk of water, and that will be a separate recipe. It'll be from its own recipe tank, drained back to another tank through a filter, and then processed through some sort of sterilizer back into the recipe tank that is supplying the system again. So those are the most common ways of irrigating propagation. So there, like I said, there is a variety of different systems out there. There are a variety of different ideas out there, and I welcome any comments, John, particularly if you have any ideas that I'm missing on this. But from there, we talk about irrigating the crop. That's a whole different ballgame again. Again, because we have a variety of different moving gutter channel companies. I can list at least 5. There's probably far more than that in the industry, and all of them work. Let me put it that way. All of them will grow a crop on them. They'll move up and down the greenhouse bay. There's a variety of different ideas as to the size of the channels, as to whether they're seeded directly in or whether there's plugs placed into holes. But they're going to start at one end of the greenhouse and they're going to end up at the other end somehow. Every moving channel company has that same basic concept. And those channels, as they move down the greenhouse bay, are going to space out as the plants get older. And so when we're designing an irrigation system, we want to be able to offer different recipes for different stages of plant life. We have gone down with many different down a road with many different growers as to what exactly that looks like. Some growers feel that they need to have 3 or 4 recipes down the row from start to finish, say a 28 or 30-day cycle. Other growers believe that, 2 recipes is plenty, one for the first couple of weeks and one for a finish at the end. So those are grower-based decisions, and we need to design the system to be flexible, because while they might decide that on day one, they might change their mind down the road. Where they decide, I do need to have 3 recipes or 4 recipes because this variety needs something different at the end. Even some of the growers will have the last channels that are going to be harvested tomorrow would be on their own separate valve, so they can leave them off if they want to make a drier harvest. So that's, again, part of the irrigation strategies that we talk about with the growers prior to putting a system together. Another thing that you'll notice between the various companies is that some growers are using a open, it's a very small tube. It's a 4 millimeter or 6 millimeter tube to pour water into the channel, 1 or 2 per every channel. Other companies suggest a pressure compensated emitter, either a 12 liter an hour or 18 liter an hour, maybe even 2 of them per channel. That offers a little bit more uniformity from front to back on a long greenhouse bay because of the pressure compensation. but requires more pressure on the pump end. So again, the design has to be from day one to match the system you're putting in the greenhouse. If you're just doing open tubes, I don't need pressure, I need volume. If you're doing pressure compensated, I usually need a little less volume, but I need a higher pressure for the compensation. So all of that traces its way all the way back to what size subheaders we put in, what size valves we put in, what size main lines we put in, and what size pumps are supplying the whole system. So that is a conversation that's a day one conversation.
Can I just to pipe up here a bit, man? I'd love it if you could talk a bit about the day stock concept, because I deal with a lot of companies. We have conversations around making specific fertilizer mixes, and then the requests could become very big from a cost perspective and from a closed separate loop. So the mentality of having one fertilizer mix and having that fertilizer mix with its own injector, with its own water storage, with its own leach collection, which is with its own sterilization, the whole 9 yards. How can you maybe just talk a bit about day stock tanks and how we can bring some savings to a customer specifically when they want to do fertilizer mixes?
Well, that's a very good point. The one thing that is almost universal in these projects is that no one ever gives enough space for irrigation.
I'm going to add to that. The first time you do it, you don't give enough space. And if you do it again, that's your problem.
Yeah, so irrigation for recirculated lettuce projects does take a lot of space. And the more recipes you want, the more space that requires. Because they do take, a similar amount of space per recipe, because you're basically dividing your farm into 2, 3, or 4. We prefer to have a recipe tank that we're drawing from and sending out to the crop that has an injector set that is looping that tank. So we're constantly correcting because we're always adding in more fresh water and we're adding in return water. And so that return water, the EC is not too far off of the target because they are super saturating those channels all the time. But we do have an EC that may be slightly higher than what you are feeding out, and the pH needs to be corrected as well. And then we're also adding in fresh water because obviously the plants are transpiring. But what we do like, and I know John doesn't have this, I do like to have a separate drain silo that all the water comes back to and goes through a filtration system. Typically, I like to have a sieve filter and then a cloth filter. I know it sounds like a lot, but there is a lot of soil that comes back from a lettuce system that is coarse, a lot of peat and a lot of vermiculite and things like that. So I like to filter that out through a sieve and then a cloth filter to get that water as clean as we can before we run it through some form of sterilization system. Those systems, again, is a different conversation, but then that water is transferred over into the recipe tank where we continue the cycle all the time. The size of those tanks, Tony, you got a question? Nope, Tony froze up, I think. You still hear me?
Yeah.
Janine, are you still there?
Yep, I'm still here.
Okay. I see
I'll have to ask this question later.
Tony's frozen in time.
All right, I didn't know if it was me or it was him. Sorry. The size of those tanks, again, are relevant to your irrigation cycles. Because there again is a discussion among growers as to how often we're irrigating. Are we irrigating continuously? Are we irrigating 7 minutes out of an hour? Are we irrigating every 15 minutes? All of those decisions drive the size of the tank that's required. So again, we need to have a little bit of flexibility. I don't want to design it so that, I can't change that process. But I certainly don't need to have something that is large enough that, I can irrigate all the time, every day, because it can take up too much barn space. So that is where decisions at the front end can save money at the back end. Now I lost John too, I think. Well, I hope, Dave, you stick around.
I'm here for you, Rob. I'm here for you.
We do have a variety of different options when it comes to sterilization. We have growers that are using UV. We have growers that are using ozone. I think that's probably the number one right now. We have an opportunity to put in some new technologies like ultrafiltration, which is a RO system that basically strips everything out except the nutrients. So we're starting to see more of that coming into this industry. And we're also currently, as a company, working on a new project where we're injecting a pure chlorine that's created on site that doesn't leave a chloride in the water, which is the issue with any other type of chlorine, so that we can have a clean system without building up chlorides in the system. So there is, at least 4, 5, 6 different ways of sterilizing the water from A to B. But that process has to happen fairly rapidly. If we are keeping our tank sizes relevant to our irrigation cycles, then I need to make sure I'm transferring that right away in a short period of time. So sometimes that equipment needs to get very big. Other projects, and I know John's is like this, has a looping system on their recipe tank. So they have an ozone or a UV system that's taking that recipe tank, looping it, dumping it back in again, and sterilizing it based on a 2 or 3 times a day cycle. That is certainly a space-saving idea, but you always risk that chance that there's something going through that you didn't catch. And in John's particular case, I understand it was a space limitation, and it seems to be working quite well. But if I had a new design personally, I would separate the drain from the supply and process, so I know 100% that the water coming in back to my plants has been sterilized. I'm just trying to think of what else we had to talk about here. I've been chattering.
You give them the opportunity, you're going to go on irrigation for sure. We did talk a bit, and it's obviously great, man. Don't get me wrong, it's great. You kind of hit it a little bit there when it comes to the mobile gutter systems or channels or gullies, whatever you want to call them. There's a lot to be said about the maximization of space, right? So this concept seems to be taking a lot more popularity, not only from a labor perspective, just because it's not as much labor to do this amount of lettuce on such a large scale, but one of the bigger points and factors and something that we can really hone in on from a climate perspective is that spacing, right? So as that plant needs its space, the mobile gutter system will give it its spacing. Sometimes there will be a transplant, depending if you're doing head lettuce, if you're doing plug-based, seeding and movement of plant. And that transplant basically takes it from a tighter in greenhouse or in germination concept type of spacing where plants are literally side by side, and a transplanter would robotically pick and move them so they'd have space. And then as the gutters move through, they space between the gutters themselves. So now you're giving that plant exactly what it needs throughout the whole process, meaning you're maximizing how many plants you can get inside of out of that facility. I'm going to shift a bit to Mr. David Taylor here because we'll talk a bit about climate and controls, and we'll talk a little bit about this one together. But yeah, Dave, how do you feel about climate?
Yeah, so my background is with Priva. I had 15 years of Priva before I joined Adept Ag. So I got the chance to work with a lot of great growers out there, a lot of systems I've seen, helping design. So, I'm pretty passionate about how the computer works with the system and how growers work it to be able to achieve the crops that they want. When we look at what happens in the crop over the life cycle of the lettuce, it's not long, but there are so many factors in the climate that can affect it, right? Common issues like bitterness or too leggy or bolting or all of these things a lot of times can be attributed right to the climate that's out in the greenhouse, right? And a climate computer is really a good climate computer, I should say, is really one of the key things that you got to be looking at, because it incorporates the irrigation, includes the climate, so the screening, the venting, the temperature control with the heat, or if you have cooling, the cooling as well too, and all of that's brought together, right? So you're not just controlling one process or another, you're controlling everything all at once. So all of these factors then can determine what the quality of the product is at the end of it. One really good thing about having a high-tech climate computer, and I should say this up front too, we support both Priva and Hogendorn with Adept. And so I'm just really talking in generality with this, but both of those systems allow you to create what's known as like a climate recipe. So you can go in and you can say, okay, for this time of year, for these cultivars, or for whatever, we can set a certain recipe, and then with a few clicks, you can put that recipe back in. So I mean, if it's the summertime, obviously you're going to have more venting. You're going to be screening maybe a little bit sooner. You're going to be irrigating more. All of these things are things you can preset in the computer and then have it do all the work for you. So instead of having to constantly watch that computer do a lot of manual adjustments, setting up the computer right away in the right way will allow you to, not have to worry about those things quite so much. Also, when it comes to energy savings, I can't overstate this too much. Like, I mean, right now, energy isn't as expensive as it has been in the past, but I mean, it's not going to stay like this forever, right? Our energy cost is fairly low, but I mean, once we start looking at a much higher energy cost, then the climate computer becomes invaluable. I mean, we can start looking at what your overall daytime and nighttime temperatures are. Just say you have a really warm, sunny day. You don't need the heating as much. Well, at night, you can really dial back on what your overall heating is to still maintain a 24-hour temperature for that crop. So the computer is already sort of pre-programmed to be able to do all this for the grower, being able to maximize the energy savings on that. And then incorporating all the different sensors. There is just so many different sensors that you can use. The bigger ones that we're seeing now are a lot of people are starting to use PAR. So really taking advantage of what their DLI is going to be for that crop. And then either supplemental lighting or shading, depending on where you are throughout the day. So you can say what you want for your DLI throughout the entire day. And then the climate computer is either going to give it light at the end of the day or supplement throughout the day to be able to meet that DLI. Or, middle of summer and, you're going to have too much sun. You're going to be able to start shading a little bit sooner to be able to meet that DLI. It really all comes down to the grower at the end of the day, though. The climate computer is a tool that's just going to be used. It's not going to do everything for people, but it is, once you have it tuned to where you want and for that crop that you have, it's basically it's going to take over the role of, I don't know, countless people just being able to adjust everything that you need inside the greenhouse.
Like that'll bring it to the point of like now you talk about your actual facility itself, and when you talk to a customer, you sit with anybody when it comes to planning out what's coming or what you're planning to grow. It mostly has to do with where you're located, and then you want to work backwards from there to maximize as much as you possibly can. That's free. So when it comes to the covering of the greenhouse itself, you want to contemplate the type of glass, whether you're using a diffusement or not. Having a glass that doesn't filter certain UV light or certain UV is imperative for lettuce, and for other crops not, right? So if you have the right glass, and then you come to the screening system, and maybe you go with a clear glass and you use like a diffusement screen to actually scatter that light, but then you use an abatement, which is like a light restricting screen to reduce the amount of sun coming in. Because what your job here from a climate perspective, computer perspective back, is to maintain consistency at that plant level all the time, as much as you can. The heights of a greenhouse are made for a reason. That's a buffer from the elements, right? So you want to be able to make sure that at crop level, it's always the same. So the climate system that Dave's referencing, we're talking about years of data, years of calculation, but also the ability to detect weather changes before you as the human could. So instead of walking in or trying to make changes quickly, closing vents a little bit, or doing something with the screen systems because you're looking outside and you see it went cloudy, or vice versa, the climate systems do this for you. So having the right components to the greenhouse to where you're located is a big deal. You can spend more. There's no doubt about it. You can sit back and spend more and put in active cooling systems and go overboard. And you can cool to a higher level. Like we always talk about wattage per square meters from a cooling perspective. And that basically means how cold can you get, how much air you can get in your facility, how much humidity you can take out of your facility. But I think from the conversation we had with Mr. Bonner last week, it doesn't have to be to the nines. It really depends on what you're putting out and, who's buying it from you. right? So you can get away with not putting your climate system in, for example, and like we talked about with everybody last week. The right screening system, a misting system, the right amount of air movement. You'll do really well because the adiabatic cooling effect can really curb the greenhouse effect, so that way you're not feeling that temperature increase on the inside of your facility. And then you can go as far as, okay, it is too hot. Like if I'm putting a facility in Texas, for example, we have to take in consideration that you're gonna have some very hot environment inside the facility itself. You kind of have to active cool, right? So the good thing about a mobile gutter system is we can add the slurves or add the air distribution beneath the actual gutters. You can engineer those tubes or the soxes, whatever you want to call them, so that way at the beginning where the gutters are very close to each other, you can pressurize and make more air come through that beginning. And then as it goes to the end of the actual sock, depending on the length of your greenhouse, you can increase that airflow or decrease according to the spacing. Like everything's custom for a reason. We can use the same slurs and the same air distribution to not only micromanage the climate, but now you can distribute CO2. And you're pushing that CO2 to the farm right at the plant level as well. And then we talk about the efficiencies, and there's multiple ways to maximize from how you produce cold water or hot water, when you produce hot or cold water. If you are running a crop and it's the summertime, you don't need the hot water, the springtime, you don't need as much hot water to keep the temperature warm in the facility itself. But you're putting on the boilers, you're running the hot water so that you can actually have CO2 as the byproduct. We store that hot water so that way in the evening when you can use that hot water, it's there, it's been created during the day when you need it to create to make it hot for CO2. Like there's ways for the efficiency of a greenhouse to be considered at every level. So the job of people like me, like us on this call, is to sit with the customers and really, really, really iron out and nail down what you want, what you're thinking, what you're producing, and where you're located, and then going backwards from there. And it's key. It's key to this whole conversation.
And just to follow up on that too, I mean, with who we are, we all start from a design standpoint with the customers as well too, right? So it's not just a product that we're selling or a service or something. I mean, we're basically designing all the systems. Like everybody on this call is really designing the systems from the ground up based on our experience, what the grower wants, what maybe a consultant is looking for, all of that put together to come up with the perfect solution to meet the region that you're in, the climate that you're in, and the crop that you're trying to grow.
Yeah, and we have different terminology, right? But at the end of the day, when you sit with somebody, you sit with somebody, anybody that may be. Don't be afraid to ask the questions and understand exactly what you're putting in or what you're signing up for. Understand exactly what's going into the farm because it literally changes that dollar. Don't sit back and say, okay, what do you recommend I do? Ask as to why the recommendations are there. Like we really need to customize and get down to the granularity of it all because, once a crop becomes very popular, like when cannabis became very popular, people were investing a lot of money at these facilities to produce cannabis. Most of it was based on theory. What was the other guy doing? What was this person doing? But that doesn't translate because that other guy could have a different strain, that could have a different location, could have a different number or dollar in their bank account. It's not that's not what this is. When it comes to lettuce, it's getting very popular now, and we're fielding a lot more conversations and calls with individuals that want to start cultivating lettuce across North America. It's specific to where you are. It don't just cookie cutter what everybody else does. And I'm like, John said a lot last week, right? And John, I know I'm assuming you kind of feel the same because you're nodding your head here and there about what I'm saying, but feel free to pop up more about it because I know you've specifically done this for those that weren't on the call last week and made it a point.
Yeah, you guys are all saying the right things, and you're saying things that it took me 10 years to figure out and experience. So you kind of, if you're going to design a place, you really have to have, this level of experience and kind of, awareness of what's out there, behind you and being advised. If you don't, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to spend too much money. You're not going to spend enough money. And it does matter where you're at. As David said, you have to have a computer control system. I'm a huge fan of Priva. I don't see how you can be successful in doing what we do without a system like Priva. I've never tried anything else. Well, I take that back. We've used lower tech systems that don't capture as much data. And I did that when I started. I did not make money when I did that. It's very inefficient. You've got to have this computer controlling your place 24/7. You're not going to be here 24/7. You're not going to make the right decisions all the time. But if you're not even here to make a decision, then what do you think is going to happen? So that's critical. Having a grower though is critical, but then also having the right systems where you live or where you're going to put your place of business, the proper systems to handle, the ambient conditions is critical too. I don't need active cooling here. We have a few days of the year that it gets really hot. We've done other things. We use high pressure mist. We use curtain systems. We're starting to chill the water now. So we do some things, to deal with the heat, but we don't get 2 months of 100-degree weather. We don't need to spend, an extra $1 million. I don't even know what it costs. I've never even looked at it because I haven't had to. But like Tony said, if you're in Texas, you better have something. You better have a plan because those plants will struggle and suffer, and you'll fail in the summer. We're in the snow belt, right? So we get a ton of snow in January and February. So our installed lighting is important. We use LED lights. Having control of that, we use power sensors on the roof, power sensors above the curtains, below the curtains, so we know what all these light levels are. And over time, you come up with, as somebody said, you have a recipe for what works for you, and you develop the recipe based on what didn't work, what went wrong. And little by little, over time, if you have the right pieces of equipment and the right control software, you're going to be successful. But starting out with the right equipment and the right computer is, and right frankly, guys, you got to have a good grower. If you don't have a good grower that can use all that stuff, don't spend too much money.
So, and a further point to what Tony was saying is that, the conversations we have at the beginning with the grower, it's really our job, Tony's job, to not just talk about what you're planning to do right now, but what your farm can be. Even if you're thinking that's never going to happen, it will probably happen. If you have 20 acres of land, you're probably going to build 15 acres of greenhouse on it someday. So you need to think about what the grand potential is and try to infrastructure for that at the beginning, because it's really hard and really expensive to do that later on.
Yeah, that's a huge point. We call that future preparation. And yes, and this is a big conversation. If you're dealing with a financial institution that understands the industry, if you're dealing with investors that understand the industry, everybody's aware of the fact that you're going to need this much cold water or this much hot water storage. You're going to need this much space for all the boilers. You're going to need this much space for all the irrigation components. And it's a lot simpler from a maintenance and access perspective to have everything in one centralized space, right? Then you talk about that distribution, which is a step further, right? So we have manifolds with basically pipes that come off the manifold. Having that manifold designed from the beginning makes anything from a future perspective cheaper, because no longer are we adding another manifold. They're adding more pumps or more valves to the system when that's already been thought of in the beginning, right? So yes, there is money up front for that. But that future preparation, just like Rob said, it's very rare that we're building a facility for a customer and they're doing one phase. It hasn't happened, because thankfully, success has come their way. They've expanded. So thinking of that in the beginning, it's big, and it really does cut your costs, because we get involved with facilities that were already built or that have been built. The first phase is already there. And when you go there and you see, okay, we have just this much space for the water technical, we have enough for one boiler, we have one manifold, we have one district, it becomes a difficult conversation, because now we're doing that again for the second phase or third phase, right? So that future prep, you're spot on there, Rob. You got to really think everything through. And I'll make a comment that it's a difficult comment to make, but I want to make it, because if there are people that are out there that are listening to this webinar, it shouldn't just be let's go and talk to a consultant and hire a consultant, and that consultant will tell me what I have to do. Especially if you're going to have that consultant be involved from a day-to-day operationally speaking perspective. Because in that situation, they are going to ask, or they're going to demand that you put a lot more into the facility. So that way you have every possible tool out there. And like Mr. Bonner said a minute ago, he didn't look at what climate looks like, or what chillers and forced air or active cooling looks like. But it can become a very expensive price tag, especially if you're basing all of your business plan on the ideal environment that is being demanded from a consultant or even the lettuce growing system itself. Challenge things. There's ways that you can just you think outside of the box instead of putting in a ton of chilling capacity. For example, what does my climate look like historically? And we provide this. It's available to you as cultivators. It's available. What is my climate history historically? What does it look like within a greenhouse? We can help you with that. If I put in this level of cooling, what am I going to see in the summer months or the hotter months or the concerning months? Meaning, what am I going to see from a humidity and temperature perspective? Do I need to be exactly perfect where I'm sitting at that 18 degrees, 24-hour temperature, and I've got my humidity at my 60%, and that's what I want it at? Or can I see a little bit of a spike to 75, and I can deal with that, and my temperature can be somewhere 24 hours, 22 degrees, 23 degrees. Giving into that and just curving those hotter weeks, you can spend a lot less money from a climate perspective. You just move air, but have that climate being a lot less of a price tag. So there's ways that you have to just ask more questions, be involved more, and just really fact check things. And I don't proclaim to know everything. None of us here proclaim to know everything. We want to make it specific to a customer, specific to a facility, and inevitably help that customer be successful because we all want to see them expand and become more successful. So that's the type of conversations you should be having when you're doing the designs for these lettuce facilities. It should be specific.
Yeah, and just to expand on what you just said, Tony, as well too, with that cooling. When I was with Priva, time and time again, we would sit down with people and go through, what are the highs and the lows, look at the overall temperature of the last 2-3 years, go through, what an analysis would be. Okay, are you just trying to dehumidify? Are you trying to cool? One of the biggest issues that we saw when it came to cooling was that, they're not cheap. Cooling systems are very expensive when you look at it, right? Expensive to run, expensive to install, but critical to some businesses, right? What we saw a number of times was that people were installing, cooling systems inside the greenhouse that were just way under capacity. And if I can say it out loud, I mean, if you're not going to put in something that's going to suit the environmental needs for where you're at, where your region is, you're better not even to put anything in at all, because you're basically just going to throw millions of dollars into a system that's going to do nothing for your crop at the end of the day. We've seen that a number of times, and it's critical. Either spend the money right away, or just don't spend it at all. Put it into something else that, like, say, a misting system, right? That's going to give you a little more humidity in the air, stop a little transpiration, rather than trying to cool everything down.
Guys, if I can break in with a question kind of related to that. On the environmental controls, they're asking, you can get, they have so many bells and whistles that you can get, and oftentimes growers get them and they don't use half of them. So they're asking, how do you find that balance between what you need when you're starting out and what you're going to need when you expand? Is customization the only way to achieve that, to kind of, get it related to your unique needs or the growers' unique growing needs?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, when it comes to the climate computers, you can start as, I don't know, as fancy as you want or as easy as you want. Like, I mean, most systems are fully customizable, right? So if you are only really worried about temperature and humidity, you can start with just a temperature and humidity set point. I don't know that that's going to get you that far. I mean, starting with every kind of sensor that's out there, it's going to be overwhelming. So yeah, I don't recommend starting with, 1,000 different sensors in the greenhouse, because it's not really going to do you any good. But, starting with temperatures, humidities, and light levels, those are going to be critical. So, I mean, I wouldn't recommend cheaping out on a system, and just because it might be a little overwhelming at first. It's like anything else out there, right? Like, I mean, you can have the best tools in the world, but if you don't know how to use them, then really they're not doing you any good, right? But over time, you're going to learn how to use it and be able to perfect your craft.
Yeah, I would add to that. The critical things are, David said it: the humidity, the temperature, and light. A lot of your most important systems run off that. Your curtains run off that. If you have artificial light, it runs off that. another in a mobile gully system, and I will tell you this from experience, knowing what the flow rates of your water are, and not so much what the flow rate is, but that the water is flowing when it should be flowing, right? You can be, it's on a Sunday barbecue and you leave the greenhouse at 2, then 3 o'clock a pump goes down and you think everything's great, and you come into work on Monday morning, probably with a little hangover, and then you go, wow, the crop's dead. So having some sensors that also tell you when things aren't right, like there's an alarm, there's some really critical things that I think are important. But like David said, when until you like understand, like for instance, having CO2 control and knowing what it is, that's not critical. Like once you get to a certain level of production where you're getting a certain amount of yield and you want to get more, well then you can add that, and then you learn more about how the lighting interacts with that and everything else. So so I think it's customizable previs anyway. You can add components. We've added all kinds of stuff. What we have now looks nothing like what we started with, but I think those things that Dave mentioned and some alarm sensors that are important are probably pretty critical.
Yeah, I would like to add to that from an irrigation standpoint, it is critical to have alarms, flow alarms, EC and pH alarms. You need to know that A, you're watering the crop, and B, you're watering the crop with the proper recipe that you're doing. Maybe your grower forgot to fill your stock tank up yesterday, and today you're out. You need to know that alarm's going to go off. You need to know that every time I irrigate, I should be flowing X number of liters or gallons, however you want to measure this thing. And if I'm not, it's because a valve didn't open, or the line's plugged, or a filter's plugged or something. But that is all critical information that it doesn't take long to have a disaster because you weren't paying attention.
Yeah, and that trickles into preventative maintenance and maintaining what you have in your facility, because it really comes down to where you're located, and that's also from who's around you from a service perspective, right? If you have access to people that can help you in a bind, if you have a pump or a failure with a valve, that would dictate the level of information you have from your system, number one, but also what should I be doing preliminarily, what should I be doing annually or quarterly or monthly to make sure that all my systems are working up to snuff. And that's a heavy recommendation from, I think, everybody on this call, that there should be standard preventative maintenance in your facility, whether you have a person or an individual or a company doing that for you. Because
or even just a phone call away.
Yeah.
I work with these companies that are on this, that are on this call. I got people's cell phone number. If it's Sunday afternoon and I need to call Priva, I got a guy that will answer the phone for me. And I can't tell you, to me, how important that is. Like, price matters, yeah. But I tell you what, if you don't know how to fix something, once you learn it one time, hopefully you'll remember it. But to be able to have some support from your vendors is pretty important. So if you're feeling vendors out, you should ask that question.
And do you have maintenance protocols, John, that every week or every month you go through and you check this and you adjust that or whatever as a regular process? Yeah,
for us, it's there's dailies, there's weeklies, there's biweeklies, there's monthlies, there's annuals. Your pH sensor, you need to calibrate it, right? You need to check it, make sure it's right. But you also need to replace it. Your EC sensors, you need to clean those things. Those don't need to be necessarily replaced, but you got to have they go bad. They're going to go bad. They're going to start getting out of whack, and they will go out of whack. It's going to happen. You can, time your watch on it. It's going to happen. So just get in the protocol of, hey, usually it takes me 2-3 months, and I see my pH starting to wander. So I'm going to go calibrate my pH sensors every 2 months. It takes, we have probably 50 of them here. It takes a couple hours to do it all. And the cost of not doing it is far more than the cost of what it takes to do it. And you have to. It's a part of the deal.
Cleanliness of your facility, oiling your pumps, changing your filters, like things that are just going to extend the life of the heavy machinery of the systems you have in place that cost you a lot of money to put in there. That's just, you got to maintain it, bring it to the head, and have a schedule, have a program.
Yeah, then you end up with less, 3 p.m. Alarms when you're at a barbecue.
Yeah.
It's you'll learn it. Like, you could take the advice of the people that are going to advise you, but it'll happen, and you see how much money you lose when you don't do it. when a crop goes down, you lose $100,000 in basil or something because you didn't check something, and then ask yourself, man, you'll say, man, I wish I would have bought that component in Priva or whatever the hell. So.
Guys, in regards to the growing systems and the environmental controls, we have somebody asking, what is your perspective on redundancy?
I'll take that one. When I started, we didn't have much redundancy at all. We have 2 of everything because it's just, like I got, for years, I didn't have a generator that would run the place. And we're lucky we have power here in Cleveland. And I don't know how at one day we didn't get like a major storm and I lost, if you lose power for 24 hours and the pumps don't work, what do you think is going to happen in a hydroponic greenhouse? Especially in an NFT greenhouse, maybe in a pond system, the plants are floating there and they'll be all right. But in this type of greenhouse, you got to have backups after backup after backup. Almost everything we have now has a backup. And the only reason I didn't install it in the first place is because I didn't realize that, what can go wrong will go wrong.
And it is a big expense up front too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about these things, and that's what scares a lot of people off from putting in those systems, putting in the redundancy. But I mean, like you said, it's critical.
And then think about it. Like, and I've dealt with this. I deal with my customers. I do all our sales too. There's a loss of, you break the supply chain for your customer when you don't have consistency of supply. That's a big deal to have the shelves full or if it's a restaurant, getting that same thing all the time. If you make a big mistake because you didn't have a backup and then you have a lack of supply for 6 weeks or something, you can lose more than just the crop. You can lose the sales for the next forever. You got to be thinking about the costs associated with those type of things because they're real and they're maybe even more expensive.
And I know that on your irrigation, you actually have a manifold so that if any one pump went down, you can just get water from another pump. It might not be the right recipe, but you're going to push water until you get this thing fixed.
Yep.
And so that's part of
we were advised that stuff. Even that. When we designed it and we used Zwart Systems, who's a company owned by Adept now, and Rob, you probably had a hand in it. It was just good advice from people that have been doing this for 30 years and have seen a lot of things go wrong. So you got to take the advice with people that have experience.
So guys, before we move on to answer a few of the last questions here, on the structures, the infrastructure side, anything there you want to comment on? As far as propagation and plant production, that's important there?
From the structure and infrastructure wise?
Yes.
Well, how granular do you want to get? Like if you're gonna customize it to a specific area, there is a lot to that from a cost perspective. I don't think in any of the systems I've seen and any of the practices I've seen that's needed. And if we're talking about propagation or germination, there's differences here. Like the previous conversation we had, we talked about having a germination chamber, and we touched on the propagation, right? The concept of going vertical in some situations and then bringing a plant to the greenhouse, that's still up for discussion and debate depending on the person and varieties. But to make something specific for propagation, no, I wouldn't suggest anything there.
I think there are limitations to the length of greenhouse bays based on the system of gutter that you're designing. You certainly can't go 1,000 feet because it's going to have a hard time moving those channels across that thing. And I really don't know exactly what those limitations are. Perhaps each company that's marketing those gutter systems would have their own recommendations as to those. But that would be a limitation in terms of the facility design.
Yeah, there are some efficiencies to gain. Like if we're talking about if we didn't have a limitation on the length of a greenhouse, right? Like Rob just touched on, you at that point in time, you can put in enough propagation space, meaning the beginning, the young plant stage before a transplant, for example, if we're talking head lettuce now, you can put enough propagation space that for the actual cultivation part, you can increase the speed of the mobile gutter system and actually reduce the number of motors or units you'd have to make that movement of gutter to reduce some of your initial costs because you can just speed up and have one motor doing more essentially. and having to take it for a longer run. But that really comes down to the limitations of the facility, limitations of your price of property, your utilities, and what you want to have at that beginning point. It's severely custom. Like that's the key takeaway. It needs to be, it's severely custom. You don't always have to have a consultant in the middle to tell you everything. You don't need to have an engineering group in the middle to have everything, or to tell and discuss and push everything. Come down to the granular level and speak at that level, and that customization and that ability is something you should be you should be considering very much so when you have these conversations. It's everything.
Okay. All right. Let's move on and answer a few questions. So anybody listening, if you want to put those in the chat now, we've got a few to start with. In the meantime, let's see, how much isolation do you need in order to make impactful changes in a dynamic environment in response to sudden change? Are there a certain number of gallons, liters, square feet, acres, whereby you can't make meaningful change? Kind of a long one.
I don't think so. I mean, we're designing these systems for the spaces and for the amount of water and everything else. Like, I think I'm speaking for everybody here. I mean, we're looking at it holistically and not just, one little bit here and one little bit there, right? Like just say that Prosby and Dad get together and we design a project. We're really sitting down and we're going through all the nuts and bolts of exactly what's needed, for that entire project. Bring it to the customers and say, okay, look, this is a perfect world. We could probably cut back here, cut back there, but this is going to give you X, Y, and Z in what you're looking for. So I don't think there's anything, the size isn't really going to depend on what limitations there are.
I think John touched on a little bit last week that there are limitations when you have a small facility, that some of the automation you'd love to have is not cost effective.
Yeah.
So there is a point. I think you mentioned like 3 or 4 acres is tough to deal with, but once you hit 5 acres, then all of a sudden all that transplanting equipment and all of that harvesting equipment becomes there's an ROI that wasn't there before.
And you know what? That's okay. You don't have to start with all that, and nor should you probably, because you probably don't know what you're doing, right? You probably need to start with not $20 million, maybe try to get together $2 million, get it going, make some mistakes that's not going to make you bankrupt, and learn, and then add things that you need as you need them. I mean, there is some basic stuff you need, and as hopefully one investment pays for the next investment, and little by little, you get to a place where you're you know what you're doing and you're making good investments that have good ROIs.
Okay. Here's one. Is the water temperature important when using, for example, ebb and flow system or other irrigation systems? Or is it expected that the water is already at ambient temperature when it reaches the plants?
Water temperature is important. We absolutely, and typically because it's a recirculated system, I'm not worried about heating the water. I'm worried about cooling the water.
Yeah.
So in most of the projects that we do, we put a chiller system in warmer climate conditions. So we take that water, we run it through a heat exchanger reverse to chill the water down. We like to keep it like 17, 18 degrees if possible. When your water warms up, you lose dissolved oxygen in the water. So you can overcome that a little bit by putting in nano bubblers. It certainly makes a big difference. But chilling the water is a better way for your root system.
Again, that's the consistency, right? We're not shocking the plant. And then when you design your facility, similar contemplation. Where am I putting my water technical area? Do I have it in the shaded area? Is sun coming down, sitting on my silo? Or is anything exposed so that the heat can be changed? These things are all stuff you have to consider. And it's part of what we do on a regular. That's how you should be designing it. But a great question, and I'm glad we hit on that. We talked about it before the call actually to talk about this. So
I would add to that, you guys, to know why. So everybody knows. When you don't have DO in the water, they're inversely related. As the temperature goes up, the DO comes down, and DO regulates kind of the uptake of nutrients to the plant. So if you've got really hot environment in the air and the water is really hot, the DO is really low. I mean, that plant is stressed out to max. So the investment to chill the water. And the other problem is there's this little thing called pythium that gets in your water. And the warmer it is, the easier it is for that stuff to, ruin your barbecue.
Yeah, what is it? Anything above 20 degrees, I mean, it's just a breeding ground for Pythium. I mean, it's almost immediate.
Having a good water room, you guys, or everybody listening, I mean, we built ours slowly to the point, and we're still adding, the last couple things. We're chilling it. We're using ozone. We're using screen filtration. We're using bubblers. We didn't start with all that stuff, but I can tell you, there's been bumps along the way where because we didn't have some of these things, it cost us a lot of money. There's a cost of not having these things. So.
And I want just to make a quick comment. Sorry, the offtake, like meaning the customers that you have, the retailers, the people that are buying that product from you, they're getting very educated. They're understanding about the different sterilization practices that you have in the facility, and it may very well be demanded of you if you want to get certain contracts to have specific technology involved. Again, everything is something that can have an explanation, a discussion, and can be scaled, and it should be considered.
You were talking about filtering the water from lettuce. Why would you filter it? And what mineral or chemical is it sensitive to?
Well, we are filtering the water. Again, we are coarse filtering the water to get any, again, depending on the media that you're growing, you're trying to get any peat or any perlite or vermiculite or even root fibers and leaves and anything out of the water that's you don't want in that water. So first we run it through a coarse filter, and then we run it through a cloth filter. The cloth filters can typically filter that water down to 20 or 30 micron. Again, I want to get as much debris out of that water as possible because the debris is a host for pathogens. So the more I can remove physically, mechanically, the easier it is for the systems that we're putting in after that, like in John's case, an ozone system, the easier it is for that to kill whatever pathogens remain in that system. So it really comes down to making it easier for the sterilizer.
And getting it out of your air, everything, getting it out of your silos so you don't have sediment, have to clean out your silos, get it out of your piping, get it out of potentially getting into any of your pumps or motors.
Well, it's your drippers, right?
Your drippers affecting the flow.
It all accumulates. It's going to accumulate, and then you're going to have a problem. So you just put something in place because that
it's
water never stops moving.
But specifically, we're not trying to take any nutrients out of that water.
Yeah.
That's not the intent at all.
Yeah, that's the biggest claim to our fame, right? From a greenhouse production perspective, it's all about taking as much as you can back from what the plant doesn't use, recycling that water, reusing that water to reduce your actual input, and obviously our footprint on the earth as a whole, right? So it's not an expensive addition that takes care of a lot of potential issues for after.
Okay, let's see. We have about time for one more. Is there a recommendation on the droplet size for a fog? This determines what system you recommend. Oh, I think they're trying to say, does this determine what system you recommend to the customer? And then they've got high pressure of ultrasonic.
Yeah. Who wants to take this one, right? But my comment is you don't want any droplets forming on your plant, no matter what. Right? So the finest as possible.
We use a high pressure fog system. It runs at about 1,000 psi. It is a 1 micron droplets. And the intent is that you manage the system so that you're not getting moisture down on the crop. So it will cycle. It will run for 10, 15 seconds, then it'll be off for 30 seconds, or whatever it takes to maintain the humidity or temperature targets you're trying to get.
Yeah, and that's all regulated by the computer too, right? Like, I mean, you're just misting, turning it off, misting it for longer, turning it off, just trying to hit your set points.
That's
and
right.
it's not that the water is going to hurt, like necessarily hurt the plant, but wet leaves breed disease. Okay, so if you're running your mist at night, you get wet disease, you have high humidity, and you have mildew. It's not going to, if it's really sunny out and you got water on the leaf, maybe you could damage the leaf because of the, it's getting scorched. But again, the environmental control will run that, but necessarily you do. If the air is really dry, you'll run the high pressure mist longer. If it's really saturated, it's not going to run very long. And that's all settings you can do in Preview. So.
Okay. I think I can maybe take one more and then we'll wrap her up. Okay, what would be the optimal ratio of runoff water to recirculate in the irrigation system after filtration and sterilization with the mobile gutter production system for baby leaf lettuce?
A very specific question. But at the end of the day, when we are irrigating, we're taking all of the runoff and bringing it back into the system. So, there is typically about, I'm going to say, if I had to guess, about 80% of the water that we're feeding a crop is coming back to the drain channel, back to the system, through the filtration system, through the sterilizer, and back into the system again. So I don't know that there's an optimum level. It just matters. It really depends on how long the grower wants to irrigate for. You can irrigate for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Water is water. The plant's taking up what it needs. The rest is going to run past. And so the grower might want to grow a drier crop and water for 5 minutes so that there's more drying out time between cycles. Or he might like to have that plant, good and wet every day. And, based on his experience, that's what works best for him in the media that he's growing with the particular strain that he's growing. So it's not a specific answer.
No, and to be clear too, I mean, like in a vine crop situation, you'd always be blending a certain percentage of fresh water with a certain percentage of return water, right? In a lettuce system, it's just about keeping that water cycling all day, every day, and then just managing your water, right? Like it comes down to disinfecting, filtering, all those things that we talked about today, but that water is just always going, unlike vine crop.
All
I
right.
have a screen that says we're overtime.
Yeah, I say we are. So we need to wrap her up. So thank you everybody for attending today. I want to thank our presenters. And again, please look for everybody at Indoor Ag, say hi, have a conversation.
We'll be there.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Enjoyed
all.
it.
Bye-bye.
You bet.
All right, bye-bye.